Welcome to our addendum on spiritual direction prepared by St. Paul Editions. This addendum, which lasts for 4 45-minute segments on the art of spiritual direction and religious counseling, is meant to complement our longer presentations on the subject of psychology and spiritual development. As you may be aware, we have done a 20-cassette series on psychological growth and spiritual development, and it would be best if anyone were watching these 4 cassettes that they would have first reviewed that longer series. If you didn't have an opportunity to do that, at least I would say it's almost imperative to review our 6-hour series, Psychology and Spirituality, so that in terms of the terminology and theory that we're using, we would be agreeing on the same theoretical structure. I think it's also important to mention that this series assumes that those who are watching it are people interested in spiritual direction and religious counseling from a personal and professional point of view. In fact, I'm going to assume that most people watching have been doing spiritual direction or religious counseling for a while. And this is simply meant to be an adjunct to your knowledge, your skills that you have already. We're going to do a couple of things. The first thing I want to do is to briefly review the history and types of spiritual direction so that we have some idea of the approach that we're taking. Also, we're going to look at a theoretical structure which I have borrowed from Father Luigi Rulla and his associates at the Gregorian University and the outstanding research that they have done in this area. I'm also going to then move into a very practical technique of counseling and spiritual direction, which I've drawn from a wide variety of authors who are well known in the field, but as you see when we go on, we will particularly mention Father Adrian Van Kam and his work, and Father Gerald Egan and his work on the skilled helper. So we'll make assumptions that you are not only people who have looked at our previous series, but you're also people who are willing to read books, because we have a number of good ones to suggest in this series, and there are many others. If I don't mention a particular book on spiritual reading, a spiritual direction, in this program, it's not that I don't recommend it, it's simply that we're limited in time. Let's take a little look at what we mean by the art of spiritual direction. From time immemorial, people have brought their problems with the divine, or their belief that they were dealing with the divine, to a variety of people who had all kinds of names, from shamans and gurus to priests and abbesses and nuns and monks. It's possibly the oldest behavioral science in the world is the art of spiritual direction. And for the most part, in most religions and in Christianity and in the Catholic Church, which has produced many great spiritual directors and canonized some and made doctors out of many, we have an approach which you might call a classical pedagogical approach, that fundamentally the spiritual director was a teacher. He taught you the lessons about the divine things. And this is rather universal even among the other major religions of the world, that guru or the spiritual master had lessons to teach. And some of you, if you are as old as I am, can remember when you were in novitiate that your novice master or novice director had a series of books that we were going to go through, a series of topics that we were going to consider, and sometimes if things weren't going the best, the novices or the postulants ended up discussing and thinking about those topics which were of greatest personal importance to the novice master or novice mistress that month. So if the novice master was working on humility, we were all working on humility. Or it often depended on whose book came back. And the novice master would say, well, you should read something by Faber, or you should read something by Newman, or Father Lean, or someone like that. So it was a pedagogical approach. And that was interspersed by problems. I have a problem. I can't pray. The other novices are driving me crazy. I think I should go home. So it was good reading and problems. Now, along around 1960-65, the modern developments in clinical psychology and counseling psychology came to roost in the world of spiritual direction. And the immense number of schools in the church were all affected by that. Probably we have to recognize that the school that was most aware of the new dimension in counseling, and this is only appropriate, was the Jesuit school. The Jesuits ran universities and colleges. They were most aware of these new changes, teaching psychotherapy, teaching counseling, teaching guidance. And so this had an impact on the very famous and classical school of Jesuit spiritual direction. And I must say that the work in this area was extraordinarily well done. And I would like especially to give credit to Fathers Barry and Connolly and their associates right here in Boston for their very fine book, The Practice of Spiritual Direction, and other things which they did to really enhance Jesuit spirituality as it developed under the impact of modern psychology. And the other schools, the Dominican, the Franciscan, the Holy Ghost Fathers through Father Van Kam, the Spiritan school, the Carmelites, everybody became influenced by the new dimensions of psychotherapy. Now, at a distinct advantage were those whose classical spirituality included a theoretical construct of development. That development did not have to be explained in any terms of modern psychology. It simply had to be a developmental approach. And that's precisely the approach that I was giving in our more popular series. The approach of the three ways is a developmental approach. Particularly adequate for this was the Jesuit approach, because St. Ignatius had very obviously used a developmental approach in the 30-day retreat and the different annotations. And I'm by no means in any way an expert on Jesuit spirituality, but having made a Jesuit retreat as a young man, it seemed to me that this was obviously a developmental approach. St. Bonaventure had certainly brought a developmental approach into Franciscan spirituality, taking his cues from St. Augustine. In Carmelite spirituality, was there ever a developmental mystical psychologist like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila? Obviously, it's always developmental. And so, spirituality or spiritual direction in its best form began to come through as the most widely practiced, form of developmental counseling in the Western world. Most spiritual directors are not aware of that. You can get hold of a book on counseling psychology, and hardly anyone will even mention developmental psychology or developmental counseling. In America, when we do counseling, it's problem-oriented counseling or question counseling. Should I go to college? Should I get married? Or why do I always feel depressed? Psychotherapy. But here was a whole field that helped people in their personal development. Now, what was very, very necessary was to try, in the middle of all of this, to preserve the idea of spiritual direction. And I'm sorry to say that unfortunately, as these things will happen, the art of spiritual direction, for the moment, seemed to have been washed over the side by the tidal wave of psychology. And by the late 60s and early 70s, there were very few people around who were willing to admit that they were a spiritual director, if they were, or they went to a spiritual director. Everybody was, if you'll excuse the expression, out to see their shrink. And being a psychologist, I found that a great many people were coming for psychotherapy who needed spiritual direction, and a fair number of people were coming for spiritual direction who needed psychotherapy. Everything was backwards. And the reason for the problem is that the client of all people was least capable of telling which they needed. If they were fairly open, fairly sensitive people, and somebody told them, well, you have a neurosis, or you have the heebie-jeebies, or the whim-whams, well, off they went for psychotherapy. On the other hand, if they were terribly defended people, and somebody said you needed psychotherapy, well, I couldn't admit that, so they went for spiritual direction. And the group of spiritual directors left grew smaller and smaller. Now, thanks be to God, this situation didn't last very long, and as I mentioned, Fathers Barry and Conley and their other associates came along. Father Van Kam and Dr. Susan Muto at the Institute for Formative Spirituality developed a magnificent synthesis of what they called foundational spirituality, basic Christian spirituality without the adaptations of the different schools like Dominican and Jesuit and etc. And throughout the country, smaller institutes began. I could make a list, and I would leave somebody out, so I won't. But in the back of my book on spiritual passages, some of the principal writers and leaders in this area are mentioned. I think it's important to note that in some larger dioceses, even lay people and religious were able to become involved. In New York Archdiocese, we started with 13 priests studying spiritual direction and spiritual development, and we now have about 500 students under the very capable leadership of Dr. Ann Wallace, a counseling psychologist who now works full-time in training people in spiritual direction. So it's been a marvelous growth, and it's going in the right direction, and we have moved away from, I think, an excessive approach of psychotherapy. Now, do recall that in our previous videotapes, we gave you a thorough and comprehensive outline of pathology. That's primarily so you can tell whether a person needs spiritual direction, counseling, psychotherapy, or as many people do, don't tell the public, a little bit of both. And in fact, I think there are times that psychiatrists, whether they know it or not, are doing spiritual direction, sometimes well, sometimes poorly. And there are times that formation personnel are doing psychotherapy and they don't know it. It's very hard to keep the lines separate. Now, I'd like to state here the very, very basic principle that I'm using, and that is that the techniques of counseling, which grew out of the educational student personnel administration profession in the United States, mainly in education, and in guidance, plus the techniques of short-term psychotherapy, effective short-term psychotherapy, not something like psychoanalysis, which takes a long period of time. These techniques can be used in a simple, direct way by someone seeking to do spiritual direction and or religious counseling. Spiritual direction is developmental counseling, in the sense that I'm using it, to help a person make progress through the three ways of the interior life and to overcome obstacles to that progress. It's a simple developmental model. Religious counseling, on the other hand, rather than spiritual direction, is what is meant by assisting a person to overcome very specific religious questions. And many, many people have questions, simple little ones like, well, if my brother is being married outside the church, can I go? Should I go? And if I decide that I'm supposed to go, what do I do? That's not exactly a question for spiritual direction. It's a question for religious counseling, and you have to have some data. You have to have some information. Many years ago, it was very easy to answer that question. The answer was emphatically no. Now, the general consensus seems to be that if you are a very close relative, maybe you should go and try to do some good. But how do you do it? And we're going to, in our outline, see how this is done. The question of religious vocation. Do I have a vocation? Should I stay? Should I go? Should I leave this community and go to a different kind of community? This is partly spiritual direction, and it is partly religious counseling. So, we're going to explore all of these differences. Now, we need here a little, or not a little, but a foundational approach, an analysis of problem areas in the growth in the life of the Spirit. So far, I have mainly focused on problem areas in the personality development and psychological makeup of the individual. Father Luigi Rula S.J. from the Gregorian University and his associates, and I should particularly mention two of them, Father Francisco Emodi and Sister Joyce Riddick. These sisters, these people have done some very interesting work in putting together basically a psychology of religious vocation and formation. And Father Rula has his own books, but perhaps more easily available to you is an article that appeared in the very fine review, Human Development, Volume 6, Number 3, Fall of 1985, called The Capacity to Promote Justice by Father David Couturier, Couturier, who I'm happy to claim as one of my confreres. Father Couturier will be finishing his doctorate next year. Now, Father Rula has given us this analysis, which I think is a very fine working one. Forget this up here, present behavior. And let's say that a person doing spiritual direction or religious counseling is confronted by a person of good will. And this person comes in and you say, well, now, what are you trying to be? Well, I'm trying to be a good Christian and, let's say, a good Carmelite. Maybe they belong to the Carmelite third order of Carmel. And I'm trying to grow in the Carmelite spirituality, and I want to follow the tradition of St. Teresa, St. Therese, St. John of the Cross. All right. What you're dealing with there is not the real person, but their ideal self. Okay, that's their idealized self. That's who they'd like to be. And if you've been around long enough, you know that there's a big difference between what we are and what we like to be. The old black reverend in the Deep South said many years ago, we ain't what we ought to be, and we ain't what we like to be, but thank God we ain't what we used to be. So there's our ideal self. And the ideal self in a reasonably well-balanced person is based on their values. 10 or 12 abstract ideas of goodness which they may have. For instance, almost all Christians have the value of charity. Love of God, love of neighbor. That would be a value. And they've learned it from good religious education, from good example, good experience. There is a hidden away self, a self that you don't quite see. And sometimes it's very small. In a saint, it almost disappears. But hidden away, not always too terribly well hidden away, are the needs of the individual. So we take the value of charity and we take the need that an individual has to be loved and cared for by other people, and the basic human proposition that people are nice to people who are nice to them, a very important fact of life, we realize that latently the apparent value of charity to others also has a very strong underpinning of need. I need people to love me, therefore I'm going to be nice to them. That's not bad. I spent my years as a reform school chaplain trying to teach people that people would be nice to you if you were nice to them. Okay. Now, there also develops, according to Father Ruler, and this is very well said, a large number of things called attitudes. And he suggests that attitudes there may be 10 times as many attitudes as there are values. So you might have 10 values, you could sum them up between the commandments and the Beatitudes, and then you'd have 125 attitudes. So for instance, an attitude of charity would be that you wouldn't like to pass a homeless person in the street. That's part of your thing, is whenever you see a needy person or a homeless person, you feel a personal responsibility to assist that person. Now, your attitude, obviously, can be partially a result of your value, but it can also be very much a part of your need. Let me give you a sad example. I know a priest who isn't very edifying. As a matter of fact, he's one of those clergy that you meet once in a while in your life who's an argument for anti-clericalism. You know, his salary should be paid by the League of the Militant Godless. And he doesn't behave very well. But he has the most profound value and attitude toward proper treatment of the clergy. He could write books on respect for the clergy. And if anyone shows the slightest lack of respect for the clergy or his position, they will get hit right between the eyes. Apparently, this is some kind of zeal for the kingdom of God and the priesthood. But it comes from over here, from his own personal needs and his comforts. God forbid that anybody should disturb him at any of his many times in the rectory when he's taking good care of himself. But if they do disturb him, they are told that they lack respect for the clergy. Right? Now here's un problema, as we say in Spanish, a problem. Now, floating around in all of this, and that's why we put a circle around it, is present behavior. Present behavior doesn't belong there. If I had a transparency, I could lay it here any place. So, if someone is doing well in religious formation and they're growing, we'll say that their present behavior is largely focused here. If they're going through all the hoops and everything else, but you wonder why they're not growing, their present behavior may be right here, between attitude and need. And they may, if they get egotistical and selfish enough, stop even fooling around with attitudes, and they just become a need factory. My beloved boss and Archbishop, Cardinal O'Connor, often reminds people that the clergy do not exist for the people. The clergy exist to, the people do not exist for the clergy exist to serve the people. And it's very important. Just the other day at the funeral of James Cagney, the actor, Cardinal O'Connor went out of his way to apologize for something that had happened in the family many, many years ago, which had troubled Mr. Cagney much of his life. And that was when his father was dying. For some reason or other, the priest did not make himself available. And I suspect if we went back and found it, whatever the problems of the priest were, they were probably more caught in their needs. Now, like all schema, that particular one is very neat, and it's good. It helps us sort things out. But as you know, people are much more complicated. And when we're doing spiritual direction, if we have a schema like this in the back of our mind, we'll be able to test out what perhaps a very apparently devout person is really saying, and how some of their attempts to be spiritual may in fact be quite egotistical and self-serving. Now, to be a good counselor or a good spiritual director, you have to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. You know, there are some people, if they chew gum, they bite their tongue when they're walking. See, they can't do both. You got to keep a couple of these in mind. Suppose we go back to our other chart that looked like a cross that we did in both of our earlier presentations, which included all the diagnostic categories. And suppose we get a person who is very, very obsessive, compulsive, very particular about fulfilling every religious duty, about dotting every I and crossing every T. I shouldn't use that example here with the Daughters of St. Paul, because the one group of people in the world that have to cross every T and dot every I are those who do publication. That's true. But suppose we get somebody who worries about everything, and they decide, by using the psychological defense mechanism of sublimation, that they are going to worry about everything for the kingdom of God. They're going to take the whole responsibility for the church, the state, the world, the cosmos, the universe, Halley's Comet, the whole world on their shoulders. They may appear to be a very highly motivated person with very generous spiritual values, a whole army of excellent altruistic attitudes, but the subplot is that they're operating on a lot of psychological need and sublimation and things like that. Okay, now, remember, we're not dealing with angels. God forbid that we ever return to the notions of spiritual direction which were common not too long ago, where a person could have the illusion that because they dotted every I and crossed every T, they were giving their complete heart to God. God forbid. The best of us are a mess. The best of us are only an approximation of what we should be. If you've ever worked with or along with a very genuinely holy, great person, you know that they have their troubles. They have their faults. They have their shortcomings. And they can be a canonizable saint, but they can still have a few cracks in the cloister. And a few places where they're either narrow-minded or myopic or ignorant or forgetful or thick-headed or what have you, okay? Now, never, ever, ever present to anyone the ideal that the latent self would disappear, that the needs would be entirely subject to the values and the attitudes would represent the needs. That's the incarnate Word. I remember one time in our province at a chapter they decided to list the good qualities of a provincial. When they got all finished, the English father who was presiding at the chapter said, "And his name shall be called Jesus," you see. That's not the purpose of spiritual direction. The purpose of spiritual direction is to help a person make the next good step where they are as best they can. Now, this leads us to the beginning of our steps. And in the next program, I'm going to outline them carefully. But let's say that the purpose of the first step in any kind of spiritual direction or any kind of counseling or psychotherapy is to get the person to express who and where they are with as little artificiality as possible. You know, if you're doing spiritual direction in very devout surroundings and you're sitting there and the person comes in and you say, "Well, brother, how are you doing?" And he says, "I'm fed up." It may not sound terribly edifying and they may not make a video cassette of it, but you know, it may be true. It may be true. And if he's fed up, you might as well know it and he might as well say it that way. It's much better to say that than to say, "Well, I'm patiently carrying my cross because it's Lent and I'm offering it all up." Chances are, if he's offering it all up, when he gets to purgatory, they're going to give it all back to him. I have a profound conviction that a great many of the things that are offered up are junk. And when we get to purgatory, they'll have a large warehouse with all this junk, and St. Peter will say, "Go in and unpack all that junk you sent up here and get rid of it." Now, the first step then is unquestionably to let the person express themselves. And here I have to mention a psychologist who's not my friend. Well, he's a lovely man, they say. I never met him. But I don't follow his school of thought. He did some creative good things, and I disagree with him strongly on a number of things, and that's Rogers. Rogers was the great psychologist of the first step. He taught people how to get people to express themselves, to accept them, not to effect closure too quickly, not to come down on them too fast. And so success as a spiritual director, first of all, requires that you be an accepting person. And you ought to try it. Look in a mirror. And if your face would stop clocks or frighten people, then maybe this isn't the field for you. My suggestion is try to look as much possible like an old bedroom slipper as you can. And try to do spiritual direction in as comfortable surroundings as possible. If you have a great big kind of bloody crucifix on the wall of your room, take it down and put up the Good Shepherd or Christ the Eternal High Priest or something like that. You know, no flagellation pictures where you're going to do it. And a couple of nice, comfortable chairs. I'd never try to do spiritual direction in a chair like this in my life. Either do it or get anybody else. They've got to relax. And they kind of have to feel that they can say what they have to say and you will accept it. You don't have to approve it. And many, many people have trouble with the difference between acceptance and approval. This is why it's always been difficult for superiors to be spiritual directors, because they have to accept and approve at the same time. And this is why, if a person is really in need of serious spiritual direction, it's better not only to get someone who is not their superior, but not even perhaps a member of their local community. Somebody at a distance who doesn't live with them, because they may have something to say which you can't approve of, but you may have to accept. Now, another thing that I would mention, I think is extremely important, is if you're doing spiritual direction outside of a religious community or with new members of a community, the most important thing to do is to find out who they are. I gave a retreat one time on an island, and there were about 15 priests and a bishop on this island. And one evening during the retreat, I had a little technique. I used to invite everybody to tell about his life. And one of the missionaries sat down, been there 30 years, and he said, "You know, I'm a convert." And not one of the other missionaries, and they all belonged to the same province of the same order, knew that this man was a convert. He was unknown. Unfortunately, we often live with people we don't know. We know an image. We really don't know them. And if someone has no one around who really knows them, they're going to be in a lot of trouble with loneliness. Now, there's an attitude to adopt toward this, and that is to get comfy, and I always practice it. I never take phone calls while I'm giving spiritual direction, except from cardinals, and they don't call too often. I get nice and comfortable, and I say to the person, "Well, before we get into that, tell me about yourself." It's a request. It's not even a question. Tell me about yourself. You know what happens? The floodgates open. You can't even stand up with all of the deluge of material you get. Sometimes I have to try to pull them down like a kite 45 minutes later so that we can get on with the next person who's there. Think of it, how many times in your life did anybody ever say to you, "Tell me about yourself," and really mean it? How many people ever said to you, "This hour is yours, and I want you to tell me about yourself. I don't know who you are. Tell me. Tell me everything you want me to know about yourself." And no, it never happens to us. And at least for modern people, it's a very, very helpful thing. Now, while they're telling you about themselves, they're probably going to include a presenting problem. And a presenting problem is something well worthwhile knowing. For religious people, the presenting problem will probably be over here. I don't know how to be charitable, I can't control my temper, I'm struggling with bad thoughts, or something like that. Or it may be over here. The underlying problem, very likely, is a need problem, and it may arise out of their psychological diagnosis. That's very, very much the problem. So suppose the person is a borderline person who is emotionally unstable. They don't even know what their underlying problem is, and they should probably never be told. If somebody has a severe underlying problem, they have to be in pretty good shape and have their ego under pretty good control before they should know it. Don't ever tell anybody they're borderline unless you're very, very sure of what you're doing and how much bad news they can take. One of the secrets of life is that everybody, including homicidal maniacs, thinks that they're normal. If you think you're normal, you've joined a very large club of ill-informed people. Now, the person may not be aware of the immense pull of needs on their life. They may have been nourishing those needs all their lives. They may have everything contrived to look very, very pious. They may be walking around through life with an imaginary poor box, put in care, concern, love, and peaches and cream for me. And who you say, who are the poor? And it's them. They're living on a poor box of emotion. I think when you're listening to the person, it's very, very wise to ask yourself, how they're relating to you. Are they relating to me as if I were their parent? Are they relating to me as if I was their sibling, brother or sister, in whom they are in competition? That's very common in religious counseling. When religious or priests are there, they often get into a sibling rivalry with the counselor if the spiritual director or counselor is approximately their age. Or if you're doing spiritual direction for an older person, they may start to treat the spiritual director as their child. And that's happened to me a couple of times. That's very interesting, when the client thinks you're their son. The best possible relationship is not parent, sibling, or child, but that they would see you as their friend. One of the best possible relationships. A relationship of friendship, of equals, and we'll see that there are some tools to use there when a person is trying to operate as a friend. We'll come around to that. Some things like self-report. Finally, it's necessary, and this is a tremendously important tool in the first stage, to lead people to a expressed and clear statement of their situation or problem. It's one of the most fantastic facts that the human ability that correlates highest with success as a psychiatrist or psychologist is verbal ability. The quality that is most necessary is empathy, or an ability to enter into another person's pain and suffering. But the ability that is most important is a verbal ability, to be able to help that person conceptualize clearly what they think. Unfortunately, what often happens in spiritual direction, because we're dealing with someone in formation, is that we force them by accident to use our words and our values. And so they can become a counterfeit copy of the spiritual director. And I've often seen that with people who had the same spiritual director too long. I knew one person had the same spiritual director for 30 years, and you couldn't tell one from the other. He was a very good spiritual director, but the person ended up being a copy of himself, a clone. Now, it's best if you can frequently say to the person, could you explain that a little bit more? Could we kind of put that together in a nutshell? I call this the dumb friar. I look kind of stupid and I say, well, I'm not quite sure I know what you're saying. Could you tell me that again? And that's a very, very good technique. Practice looking dumb, and they will be forced to take the initiative to verbally express to you what's necessary. And they'll do a much better job with their own words, even if those words are a bit inaccurate, than they would do parroting some words of someone else. And so in our next segment, we're going to go on with the major steps and major tools of counseling as a form of spiritual direction. Welcome to the second segment of our series on the art of spiritual direction. And in this segment, we're going to go very directly into techniques. Techniques to be used in the course of the various stages of spiritual direction as a form of counseling. Two books which I want to very much bring to your attention are Father Adrian Van Kam's book, The Art of Existential Counseling, and this is published by Dimension Books, and also The Skilled Helper by Father Gerald Egan. There's a new edition of this which I did not have available, but this is published by Brooks Cole Company. And they will be in the bibliography of the course outline which you'll receive. In the course of the years, from various points of view, steps toward effective counseling on a cognitive and emotional level have been developing throughout the whole scene of professional counseling and psychotherapy in the United States. And we're simply going to try to apply these insights now. You know, there are forms of counseling and psychotherapy that don't use these steps. But I would say that these steps characterize what might be called the more general eclectic approach to counseling, which is sometimes called rational emotive, sometimes called cognitive, sometimes called existential, whatever you wish to call it. What these steps try to do is to use all of the potentials of an individual in their growth. They don't just use the mind or the intelligence, they don't use the emotions strictly, they use everything you've got, the kitchen sink. And these 4 steps, which are simply outlined here, but which will be much more thoroughly outlined in your guidebook, represent where I would see most theoretical counseling techniques at the present time. We've already spoken about step 1, ventilation, the establishment of a trusting relationship, the opportunity for the person to develop some kind of transference or relationship to the spiritual director, either as parent or sibling, which is less desirable, or child, but preferably as peer. And we move now to the second step, which is the exploration of the problem and insight into it. The third step, which we'll talk about in another cassette, is decision-making and the integration of the insight into the life of the person. Now, something I want to point out to you that fits into our earlier theoretical construct on spiritual development. Remember, we said that as a person makes progress in the spiritual life, their basic underlying anxiety goes down. Consequently, their reliance on defense mechanisms goes down. Consequently, they are less defended. You may recall in our map of the spiritual life, there is a line descending like that and another line ascending, and they actually theoretically cross at the beginning of the illuminative way. This descending line refers to basic substantive anxiety about life, about self, about survival. We also have a conscious anxiety, and I make the lines wavy because you know as well as I do that things like anxiety go in waves. Suppose a person is rather anxious as they come for spiritual direction. If the first step is well done, their level of anxiety goes way down, and with it, their defense mechanisms. So that in the second step, they are much better prepared for insight and exploration into the difficulty. Now we're starting to use some things that we learned before. Remember our neurotic friends, when they're very anxious, they're filled with the defense mechanisms of rationalization, intellectualization, thinking up doing good reasons for doing bad things, being very repressed, being very uptight. Remember that? It goes down. If you are a good spiritual director, or a good counselor, or a good person in formation, you are going to be able to bring that person's level of anxiety down easily and without noticing it. You simply sit there and say, tell me about yourself. You show acceptance. You keep your mouth shut. You don't say to anything, because the sooner you say something, you start to close the discussion off. It's very important to sit there and even listen through periods of silence. If the person says they did something wrong or something stupid, don't volunteer that information. I'll tell you when to do that. Don't say it yet. And you set up a trusting, accepting relationship. It's also important at this time, as the person kind of tells you their whole story, where they are, if they're in a problematic situation, to encourage them to keep going, because they're going to do good. They're going to be able to handle this situation. Just this morning, I had a very difficult situation to deal with. I had to tell a person that I did not think that the person was called to religious life, and he's been very anxious to do so. Very anxious, although he's tried before, to try again. And I had to say to him, look, I'm sure you can lead a good Christian life. He is. He's a good person. He has plenty of insight, but he is absolutely psychologically unfit for community life. And if he tries it again, he's going to have another breakdown. And so I had to say to him, look, your Christian community is not going to be this order or that, or this diocese or that. It's going to be your parish. You're going to be a Christian living in the world. And I am absolutely convinced that you can do this and do it well. I felt very badly about putting this on him, but I spent a lot of time reassuring him that he could do well starting out where he is right now. And I'm convinced about that about anybody. With the grace of God, everyone can take the next good step. It may not be my idea of the next good step, but it could be their idea of the next good step. Now, that's how we terminate the first step. We call it a kind of challenge to the individual. We ask them to summarize where they see things in their life and what they've said, and we ask them also to see if they can make some kind of simple statement of what their problem or their next challenge is. You might say, well, sister, now that we've looked at all that, and you're here in the Novitiate, what do you think your spiritual goals should be for the next few months while you're here? You may not agree. You may see it quite differently, but let the person say it. They'll have to be partially right. They're someplace or other, they won't be entirely wrong. Then we start a period of exploration. And here is where you give information. You don't give any information before here. Okay? If you give information too soon, you may give the wrong information. Or you may give the information and you may not have heard the whole problem. You may not know everything that's troubling the person. So you rush to the answer. The person says, well, I have a great problem with scrupulosity. Well, your trouble is you have obsessive compulsive neurosis. I watched this video cassette by Father Benedict, and he said you have obsessive compulsive neurosis, and what you have to do is start trusting God, because you really don't trust God enough. Well, that's the end of that discussion. What you may not know is that their scrupulosity and obsessive compulsive neurosis may be keeping them from something worse. They'll give up being scrupulous and move into absolute depression. That could happen. They could go backwards. I know people who, to get over scrupulosity, embarked on a life of sin. You know, they stopped their scruples. Let me tell you, I've seen a few people, you know, who used to blush at improper fractions, and when they decided to get over being repressed, Barnum and Bailey couldn't get them back in the cage. Then we, after having given information, and no one, by the way, has more information available to them than a spiritual director or religious counselor. It's where we're way ahead. We have books on every conceivable subject. We go from Genesis to the Apocalypse. And any good spiritual director nowadays has available at their fingertips a large number of good titles. So somebody's depressed, well, there's a half a dozen little books out on depression. Give them a book on depression. They lack confidence in God, get them a book on confidence in God. Bibliotherapy. And you don't have to outline the book. Tell me what you think of this book. Take this. I found this helpful. Tell me what you think. There's all kinds of other information that the person may not be using and that they should know. I realized when I was writing my book on chastity that there's a great deal of misunderstanding, for instance, about sexual dreams. All sorts of people feel guilty about sexual dreams. And it's an actual piece of theological information that not only is a person not responsible for their dreams, but indeed when you understand the psychology and physiology of dreams, sexual dreams may be an almost necessary component of a celibate life. Other than that, or repression, which could cause depression. That's a piece of information. It's something that a person might not know. Psychiatrists and psychologists, unfortunately, do not make much use of bibliotherapy. And perhaps they avoid it because sometimes the clients are too ill. But the spiritual director and religious counselor has a whole library of things. It may be meditation on sacred scripture. It may be only a psalm. It may be some little thing. Give me an idea of what you think about this. Tell me your religious experience. How did you feel during Lent? Self-report. All of this is part of information gathering and giving. Now, there are several steps of insight, which they're techniques of gaining insight, which are suggested by Father Egan, Father Gerald Egan, and in his book, The Skilled Helper. And I want to give him full credit for these. I have found these techniques, which we were all using, particularly helpful since he outlined them. And this is from an earlier edition of his book. But you'll see the way these techniques work, and you can make one of your own. Every good gardener has a couple of special tools just of their own that nobody else ever saw, a combination of a hoe and a rake or a broom and a rake or something like that. You know, every good gardener's got a favorite tool. These are some of the techniques. And remember, what you're trying to do is help the person whose anxiety has gone down to see more clearly into themselves. For instance, you might say, well, I'm not quite sure, but in your mind you're saying, what are they really saying? Don't put words in their mouth, but we Americans, we love to make implications so that we don't have to stand up for what we're really saying. One man said to me, if my wife goes to work, I'm going to leave home. I'm going to quit. So I says, in other words, you're going to get a divorce if your wife does this. I didn't say that. He certainly did. I said, in other words, your marriage is in crisis. No, it's not in crisis. My wife is just being stupid. He's not saying it because he's the one that's putting the marriage in crisis. So get people nicely to say, are you really saying this? Or what's the implications of that? This is very similar to another nice tool to clarify the obscure. What are you really saying? And we Americans, you know, we love to use rationalization and intellectualization, long words. A friend of mine recently went to the doctor and he said, well, as a result of an inoperable abdominal blockage, you are rapidly approaching a terminal period. And this lady's a tough Irish lady from the Bronx, and she says, am I dying? He said, well, she said, I am or I'm not. Am I dying? He said, yes, you're dying. Well, why didn't you say it? She said, if I'm dying, I better get ready. But you see, we gild the lily. We pack everything in styrofoam, and half the time you don't know what the person really means. Get people to clarify by saying, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Could you tell me that? By the way, you don't use these steps in order. They're like tools in a tool chest. You use one as you need it. Another very fine one is to identify patterns or themes in a person's life. Did you ever see anybody do the same old thing over again? Of course they did, because of their stable personality structure. Some people make trouble for themselves, some people fight themselves. And in fact, sometimes the pattern goes from father to son and from daughter to mother, or from mother to daughter. Did you ever see that? In a family, people will do the same thing over and over again for a couple of generations. And this is identifying a pattern. Now, the worst thing to do, of course, is to come at this with a hammer and say, well, your whole problem is that your father was a loser and you're going to be one too. Don't do that. That's the end of spiritual direction. But you might say, well, you've been in 5 assignments and you had trouble with all of the superiors, who you described in different ways. Is it possible that there might be some other common denominator, other than the possibility that all the superiors in your community are crazy, which is what they usually start off with, you see? And they'll say something like, well, maybe it's me. And I always say, you really think so? They're going to go home and say, the light dawns. They have trouble with all their superiors. But I don't want to. I have great respect for authority. That's the value. But what's the need? Maybe the need is to get attention by causing trouble. If you're a superior, you're usually well aware that it's, 20% of the people who take up 80% of the time. That's an old phenomenon. Oh, here's one. To factor out causes. Priest comes to me and he says, I'm having a terrible time. I wanted to be a priest. I thought I had a vocation. I used to enjoy being a priest. But I'm fed up. I'm through. I can't take this. God wouldn't be asking this of me. I said, gee, I'm sorry to hear that, but what are some of the problems? Oh, the problems. He said, well, I wish I was a pastor. I'm 40 already, and I haven't been a pastor yet. In our diocese, you have to be 45, and the present pastor I have, he's a nice old man, but he drives me crazy, and the other assistant is one of these people that goes in for balloon liturgies and peanuts and all this, and I can't stand that. And on top of that, my mother is very ill, and my father is not doing well at all with it. And you say, Father, you know what? You have a whole lot of problems. It may not be the priesthood at all. You say, Father, you know what? You have a whole lot of problems. It may not be the priesthood at all. Let's take a look at these. Maybe you need a transfer. The transfers aren't always the answer, but sometimes they are. Let's back the 36 cement mixers down off the bridge and see if we can make some sense out of this thing. One young man came to me, I'll never forget. He says, I can't pray. He says, I took this prayer course. I'm very interested in prayer. I studied centering prayer. I went up to the Trappist, but I can't pray. I said, well, when do you pray? He says, about 1 o'clock in the morning. I said, well, why do you pray at 1 o'clock in the morning? He said, well, I have to wait till I'm finished work. I said, I thought you went to college. He said, well, I do go to college, but I work at McDonald's from 4 to 12. I says, well, isn't that a lot of work? He says, well, I'm trying to get ready for my marriage. We're trying to save up money for our first apartment and the furniture. And he says, on top of that, my fiancé and I give engaged marriage encounters, and then there's the Curcio. And then, of course, we're in the prayer group, and she's a leader. I said, if you figure out your time schedule, you're busy 172 hours a week without sleep. The problem is that he can't pray. The problem is he's falling asleep. People never see that. They never see that. That's why we need counseling. Another interesting one is to get the person occasionally in the course of spiritual direction to summarize things, to put it in a nutshell, to get them to put it all together. I'm in a lot of trouble with this. You may be talking to them for a few times, and then you say, well, let's kind of take stock of where you are. And if they're an intelligent, literate person, they can do it. They'll say, well, when I first came to talk to you, I didn't realize this or that, but now I'm beginning to see it. And especially if you do spiritual direction occasionally, like with an older person, you might see them 4 or 5 times a year. Not a young person in formation, but an older religious or a priest or a lay person who's devout. I might see them, well, we'll say 6 times a year, but it ends up being 5. And I always get them to summarize where they've been, where we're going. I always say, well, now tell me current events. What's going on? Finally, there's a very, very interesting technique that Carl Rogers didn't believe in, but it's called self-report or self-reference. It's an age-old technique. It's where you put a little of yourself very carefully into the counseling. Very carefully. Because you don't want to distract them. But if you've been through something similar to what they've been through, you can let them know it. If you're the novice mistress, you can always say, well, when I was a novice, I had a similar problem. Don't get too far into it or they'll end up counseling you. I've seen that happen. I knew a psychiatrist who was in such bad shape that the patients should have been getting paid, you see, because he was telling them all his problems. Now, another interesting one is confrontation. Be careful with confrontation. Let's talk about the technique of confrontation, which is called immediate speech. Immediate speech is when we say something without regard to its wrapping and packing material. We just say it. Now, New York City is a city of immediate speech. You go into the park in New York and there's a big sign that says, no! And next to it says loitering, spitting, making noise, walking in the park, bicycling, motorcycling, etc., breathing. No! When I was in London, I was in the metro or the subway, and the sign said, standing in front of the doors may prove dangerous to oneself and inconvenient to others. In New York, it says, no standing. Okay? Now, New Yorkers particularly like immediate speech, and it's probably because we're such a blend of ethnic groups and cultures. Shut up and sit down, they'll tell you in New York, right like that. That's immediate speech. Immediate speech has to be used very carefully, whether it's used in a very positive way or a very negatively constructive way. Never use it just negatively. And some people can't do it. Religious decorum permits them always to say, well, I think that's very nice. The word nice was never used in immediate speech once in the history of the world. Oh, I think you're doing very nicely. Well, so is everybody else, so that means nothing. If you use positive immediate speech, be careful because you may reinforce the person so much they'll never tell you the truth again. Most of us don't get many compliments, and so once somebody gives us a compliment, we're not likely to tell them the truth anymore because we wouldn't like to lose this source of compliments. And if you decide to encourage something with someone, you say, now, sister, I know you're very depressed and discouraged, but I think you're doing a good job, nevertheless. That's immediate speech. It's affirmation. Just be careful. She may never tell you the truth again. So do it gently. If you decide to be in immediate speech about negative things, my suggestion is use a little bit of humor. I had a spiritual director when I was a seminarian. He's still alive and very old, Father Maurice. And he was a man of simple words. And one day in the course of spiritual direction, I was about 19, He said, "You know, Benedict, you have the worst logic of any person I ever met in my whole life." And I remembered that. Another day, was having a bad time, and we had a dog named Bongo. And he said, "What you should do is take life like Bongo takes life, one day at a time." I remember. My first spiritual director, the old Jewish tailor, Izzy, gave me the best advice I ever got in my life. I think I mentioned it before. I can still see him the day I went on a visit, sitting behind the counter in the tailor shop, and he says, "Be a good boy. Be a good boy." That's immediate speech. Now, if you decide to use negative immediate speech, my suspicion is that you will probably never do any more spiritual directing with this person. Oh, you may be their boss. You may tell them what to do. But most people are so fragile that one real direct negative confrontation will wipe it out. Now, maybe you should. I was working with a brother one time, and he was about to make the worst mistake of his entire life, which he made. And all he wanted was reinforcement in this mistake. He thought he was on a streetcar named Desire, and it was a minibus named Disaster. And he went off and he made a private directed retreat, and some people who give private directed retreats probably should be sent for taxidermy, because they made the retreat on the statement, "The Father is very pleased with me." How do you know? It could be a gratuitous assumption, couldn't it? How do you know? And he spent the whole 4 days telling them that God the Father was very pleased with what he was doing. And when he got back, I knew I was about to end this relationship anyway, and I said, "You know what? I don't agree. I'm sorry. I don't think God the Father is so pleased. And if he is pleased, he's got a sense of humor, I'll tell you that." Well, that was the end of the relationship, but at least one person in life told him something that many years later he may remember. But it was over. Now, again I say, in the course of this, get the person to summarize. Get the person to put themselves down in a few simple declarative sentences. If you don't know what summarizing is, sit down and do a summary of yourself. Describe yourself in 3 English paragraphs: ethnic origins, sociological situation, vocation, present spiritual state in the purgative, illuminative, or unitive way, which you're probably not in the unitive, and what you better do next. Do it for yourself. Put it away and read it 3 weeks later, and you'll say to yourself, "Good Lord, is that me?" And what's happening is you're defining your own self-image. Now, while all of this is going on, hopefully the person is not just getting insight. Hopefully the person is looking into that problem that I presented in Father Rula's terms. Are they doing what they're doing in the name of God or spirituality for their own ends and purposes? Or are they doing it for the values given in the gospel? Father Rula is quite explicit and puts it quite nicely about what he believes are the values, and it is nothing utterly unique, but he said, Father Couturier says, religious life is self-transcendent since it's based on and leads toward union with God and the imitation of Christ. The internalization of the values rather than the needs requires that a person have as their basic goal in life, their basic value, the desire to imitate Christ, to do the will of God, to follow the 3 evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which have been internalized. And I would certainly suggest that you read this article, which summarizes very well Ruler's process of internalization of these values for the person. Now, I should tell you something discouraging from Ruler's work, and that is that having studied a large sample of seminarians and religious during their formation period, he saw relatively small, in fact, very small changes in their basic value orientation. They had a lot of words, a lot of theories, a lot of window dressing. But how much was there a cutting away of the real narcissism, of the real need fulfillment rather than value fulfillment in the present behavior of the individual? If we get some insight because we have been accepted, we can discover some things about ourselves. That's the crux of psychotherapy, counseling, of psychology and psychiatry, and of spiritual direction. Get accepted, get a view of what you're doing, be honest enough to face some of it, and you will change. Now, of course, this needs a great deal of prayer. You know why it needs prayer? Because we're so appalled when we find out that most of our virtues, which we thought were virtues, are really vices. That much of what keeps us doing apparently the will of God and following religious life is a dressed up personal need. When I was a kid, I'll give you an example, my father used to call me windy. I talk so much. I was always talking. And then I went to novitiate in the seminary, and we had the Silencia monument. I didn't talk for 8 years, hardly at all. In the Capuchins, we used to talk a half hour every day, and we had nothing to say anyway. And so for 8 years, I stored up all these words and all these ideas, and I've been living on them. And she says, are you out preaching the gospel? I'll think about that question for the rest of my life. I hope. I hope. Now, when all of this is done, we move to a third and extraordinarily crucial part of spiritual direction, which is decision making. I have to let you in on a secret. In contemporary psychology, decision making was played down. I'm glad to say that in many ways and in many terms, decision making is beginning to come back. One of the reasons that it was played down is because when psychology and psychiatry gave birth to psychotherapy, which was sometime in the 20th century and primarily after the Second World War. You know, the first clinical psychologists came out of the Second World War. The career didn't exist before the Second World War. Psychiatry as a career really didn't exist before 1900, and there were very few psychiatrists. When it came out, psychology was dominated by people who did not believe in free will. They were called behaviorists. And many of them had grown up in old-fashioned Calvinist homes where they were taught predestination as children. So they really did not think that human beings could be free. It is a tribute to Carl Rogers, who again I say annoys me, that he quietly moved into psychology a notion of a kind of decision making. He said, allow the person to become fully emotionally themselves and they'll do what they're supposed to do. I don't agree with that because of original sin. But it was a way of getting the idea of decision making in. You could blame decision on emotion. The great Dr. Allport, Gordon W. Allport, who wrote the great books on personality, a professor at Harvard and a very fine Christian, preached often at Harvard Chapel. Dr. Allport called it a functional autonomy. It seemed that the human being functioned as a free person. Well, with Frankl and various other psychologists, Adler, to some degree Jung, Sullivan, many others, gradually the notion of making a decision, and a clear decision and a somewhat free decision, came into psychology. And now we are talking about people making decisions. And so when I'm doing spiritual direction, one of my biggest questions is, what do you want? Because as the Hindu Bible says, what you want, you'll get. And our Lord says it in a kind of parabolic phrase, where the body is, there shall the eagles be gathered. Where your treasure is, there your heart shall be. What do you want? Okay. Now, we have to distinguish here between overall goals of life. For instance, we have basic human goals. Everybody wants to have a certain kind of contentment. They may call it happiness, they may call it peace. They want a balance between what they need and what they have. Many people also want a further contentment, which comes from feeling that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, a kind of inner peace. I don't like what I'm doing, but I know I'm supposed to be doing it. It's the will of God. I accept it as the will of God. Therefore, be my guest. I'll make my day. I'll go first class. Okay, that's a decision. And it's related to an overall goal of serving God and pleasing God. And that overall goal is a marvelous one. The trouble is, in spiritual direction, people often don't work out the intermediate goals that go with it. And the reason they fail to do that is because their goals really do not reflect strong values, but rather strong needs. So the person says, I want to be a religious because I want to be a saint. I'm going to shock you. Whenever I say to a young man, why would you like to be a religious? And he says, I want to be a saint. You know what I say? Forget it. God. Forget it. Because it's a great thing to want to do the will of God. But when you tell me you want to be a saint, you've got a little plaster of Paris statue in the back of your mind holding some implement of your sanctity that will identify you to all mankind, a kind of Benziger Brothers statue of Saint Catherine of Alexandria holding her wheel. See? That's a plaster of Paris saint. There's nothing wrong with the goal of wanting to be a saint. I think it was Leon Blanc who says there is only one tragedy, and that is that we are not saints. But that's a distant overall goal. What about doing what you're supposed to be doing now? I know several people who gave up their vocation because they wanted to be saints. I know several people who did it. They had this glorious picture of themselves there, you know, sort of in The Sound of Music or something like that, and they were unwilling to do the dishes. It's extremely important when people have goals that they be realistic and specific enough that they can give rise to intermediate goals. Did you ever know anybody that wanted to get a driver's license but never got around to registering to get a driver's license? They never made the trip to the license bureau. All sorts of people go through life with wonderful plans of what they were going to do, but they never did the first thing to get started. They wanted to learn how to type, but they never got a typewriter. I know all sorts of people. Now, to me, I was trying to learn Spanish, and a boy stole my cassette tape. Exercicio Primo, and I never got around to buying the next Exercicio Primo. I already was listening to it, and he stole the whole word. One's long-term goals is very, very important for clarification, especially in vocational decisions. Suppose a young person, a religious in formation, is off the track. They're wasting a lot of time. They're letting their personality and their whole spiritual life go down the drain. Or they are thinking of leaving because there's too much imperfection, there's too much shortcomings, and they can't put up with it all. What they're going on is a very vague projection of themselves, largely related, I think, to sublimation. They would like to be a saint this moment. And they're not paying any attention at all to the steps necessary to do that. It's the job of a spiritual director to get a person to look at their goals and their decisions and their intermediate goals. And this has to be done by, again, those same techniques which we talked about in step 2, but even in clearer terms. Now, in our next technique, we're going to talk about integration of this and how it fits into a person's life situation.